The morning sun streamed through the towering glass windows of Elite Technologies headquarters as a new face made her way through the bustling lobby. Mrs. Lay, fresh from completing her MBA at Harvard, carried just a simple laptop bag and wore a confident but humble smile. Unlike most executives who'd march straight to their corner office on their first day, she had different plans in mind. "Good morning," she greeted the security guard warmly. "I'm starting today in the innovation department." She intentionally left out her director title, a detail that would soon prove significant. The guard, Mr. Rodriguez, checked his list and handed her a standard employee badge. "Welcome to Elite Tech. Let me show you to the general office area on the 3rd floor." As they rode the elevator together, Mr. Rodriguez chatted about the company culture. "Most of the new folks start in this area," he explained, not realizing he was speaking to the newly appointed Director of Innovation. Mrs. Lee listened intently, picking up valuable insights about the day-to-day operations from someone who saw everything. The 3rd floor was a maze of cubicles and shared workspaces, alive with the gentle hum of keyboards clicking and quiet conversations. Mrs. Lee chose a desk in the corner, setting up her laptop while observing the dynamics around her. She noticed how people interacted, the informal leaders who others naturally gravitated toward, and the underlying currents of office politics. During her first few days, she immersed herself in the company's rhythm. She joined casual lunch conversations, participated in team brainstorming sessions, and even helped troubleshoot the eternally jammed printer. Her colleagues, thinking she was just another new hire, spoke freely around her about both the good and bad aspects of working at Elite Tech. "Watch out for the regional manager," one coworker whispered during a coffee break. "He can be difficult, especially with certain people." The way they said it made Mrs. Lee's instincts tingle. There was clearly more to the story. She spent her mornings reviewing project proposals that others had dismissed, finding hidden gems of innovation in unexpected places. In team meetings, she asked thoughtful questions that made people stop and think differently about challenges they'd given up on. Her genuine interest in others' ideas and her ability to build on them quickly earned her respect among her peers. By Thursday, she had compiled a comprehensive presentation about potential innovations that could revolutionize the company's approach to customer service. The ideas came directly from conversations with frontline employees, people who dealt with customers daily but rarely had their voices heard in upper management. "I've never seen someone grasp our challenges so quickly," remarked one of her cubicle neighbors, genuinely impressed by her insights during a team discussion. "It's like you've been here for years, not days." Little did they know that Mrs. Lee's approach was intentional. As the incoming Director of Innovation, she believed that true leadership meant understanding the company from the ground up. Her week in the general office area had given her invaluable perspectives that she could never have gained from an executive office. She worked late into the evening, refining her presentation for tomorrow's department meeting. Her screen glowed in the dimly lit office as she incorporated real examples and practical solutions she'd gathered from her conversations throughout the week. Each slide was carefully crafted to address both the human and business aspects of innovation. As she finally packed up to leave, the cleaning staff arrived for their nightly rounds. She greeted them by name. She'd made a point to introduce herself to everyone, from the CEO's assistant to the maintenance team. To her, every person in the building contributed to the company's success story. Walking to her car in the nearly empty parking lot, Mrs. Lee felt confident about tomorrow's meeting. She had no way of knowing that it would become one of the most challenging days of her career. A day that would test not only her professional capabilities, but also her personal strength and leadership philosophy. The security cameras caught her final wave goodbye to the night shift security guard as she drove away. Tomorrow would bring unexpected confrontations and revelations that would shake Elite Technologies to its core, but for now, Mrs. Lee was simply another dedicated employee, preparing to make a difference in her own quiet way. The conference room buzzed with anticipation as employees filed in for the department meeting. Mrs. Lee arrived early, setting up her presentation while greeting colleagues with the same warmth she'd shown all week. The morning light filtered through the blinds, creating stripes across her carefully prepared slides on the projection screen. "Is this your first big presentation?" whispered her cubicle neighbor supportively, still thinking she was a new hire. Mrs. Lee just smiled and nodded, knowing that the next hour would change everything. The regional manager, Mr. Porter, strode in 15 minutes late, his presence immediately changing the room's atmosphere. People sat up straighter, conversations died down, and several employees exchanged knowing glances. He dropped his leather briefcase on the table with a loud thud and waved impatiently for the meeting to begin. "Let's not waste time," he announced, not bothering to apologize for his tardiness. "I understand we have a new perspective to consider today." The way he emphasized new made it sound like a criticism rather than an opportunity. Mrs. Lee stood confidently and began her presentation. "Thank you all for being here. Over the past week, I've had the privilege of working alongside many of you, and what I've discovered is incredible potential for innovation that's just waiting to be unleashed." She hadn't even finished her first slide when Mr. Porter interrupted. "And what exactly qualifies you to make these assessments?" His tone dripped with condescension. "I've been managing this region for 8 years, and suddenly someone fresh off the street thinks they understand our business." The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Mrs. Lee maintained her composure, gesturing to her market analysis graphs. "These numbers actually tell an interesting story." "Numbers can be manipulated to say anything," Mr. Porter cut in again, leaning back in his chair with a dismissive wave. "Perhaps in your previous experiences, things were different. But here at Elite Technologies, we have standards." A few employees shifted uneasily in their seats. One woman began typing frantically on her phone under the table, likely documenting what was unfolding. Mrs. Lee took a deep breath and continued professionally. "If you look at the customer feedback data..." "Listen," Mr. Porter stood up, his voice rising. "I don't know who thought it was a good idea to let you present today, but clearly you'd be more suited for an entry-level position. Someone with your background should understand the importance of paying dues and knowing their place." The silence in the room became deafening. Someone's coffee cup clattered against their saucer, the small sound echoing like a gong in the tension-filled space. Mrs. Lee straightened her spine and looked directly at Mr. Porter. Her voice remained steady, but carried a quiet strength that made everyone lean forward slightly. "My background," Mr. Porter, "includes an MBA from Harvard, 10 years of corporate strategy experience, and a track record of turning struggling divisions into industry leaders. But more importantly, it includes the wisdom to know that true innovation comes from listening to people at all levels of an organization." She clicked to her next slide, which showcased testimonials from Elite Technologies' own employees, people in that very room. "These insights come directly from your team members who care deeply about this company's success." Mr. Porter's face flushed red. "This is ridiculous. I won't sit here and be lectured by..." "By whom exactly, Mr. Porter?" Mrs. Lee's question hung in the air, giving him just enough rope to either recover or hang himself professionally. The room held its collective breath. But before he could respond, Mrs. Lee continued her presentation, methodically laying out her findings and recommendations. She acknowledged every interruption with professional courtesy, deflected every personal attack with data-driven responses, and maintained her dignity even as Mr. Porter grew increasingly agitated. Other managers and team leaders in the room began nodding along with her points, some even taking notes. This only seemed to infuriate Mr. Porter more, but each time he tried to undermine her, she responded with such well-researched insights that he found himself struggling to counter them. The presentation concluded with a comprehensive roadmap for implementing her suggested changes. As she asked for questions from the audience, several hands shot up, but notably, none of them belonged to people who usually aligned with Mr. Porter. "This is absurd," Mr. Porter finally exploded, standing up again. "I don't know who you think you are, but I'll be taking this to the CEO myself. We'll see how long you last after that conversation." Mrs. Lee calmly gathered her materials, maintaining eye contact with him. "I look forward to that discussion, Mr. Porter. In fact, I believe we're scheduled to have it in about 48 hours. She thanked the room for their time and walked out, leaving behind a mix of shocked faces, hidden smiles, and one particularly confused and angry regional manager. As she headed back to her desk in the general office area, she could hear the buzz of conversations erupting in the conference room behind her. Little did Mr. Porter know, But his outburst had just set in motion a chain of events that would transform Elite Technologies forever, and his own career would never be the same. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the office windows as Mrs. Lee sat at her modest cubicle, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. Though her face remained composed, her heart was still racing from the morning's confrontation. She opened a fresh document and began typing, recording every detail of the incident while it was still fresh in her mind. The office around her had changed. Where there was usually the steady hum of workplace chatter, now there were whispers and meaningful glances. Some colleagues walked past her desk deliberately slowly, as if wanting to say something but not quite finding the courage. Finally, one of the senior team members, Mrs. Chen, approached with 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might need this," she said softly, placing 1 cup on Mrs. Lee's desk. After a moment's hesitation, she added, "What happened in there? It wasn't right." Mrs. Lee looked up, offering a genuine smile. "Thank you, both for the coffee and for saying that." Mrs. Chen glanced around before pulling up a chair. "You should know, this isn't the first time. Mr. Porter, he's been here for years, and," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "let's just say many good people have left because of him." As if this conversation had broken a dam, other colleagues began stopping by throughout the afternoon. Each had a story to tell, an incident to share, or an apology to offer for their silence during the meeting. Mrs. Lee listened carefully to each one, taking mental notes while offering reassurance that speaking up now still mattered. Last year, during the holiday party, one IT specialist shared in hushed tones. He made comments about my accent that made me feel so small. I nearly quit that week. Another employee sent a discreet email. Remember how he said he's been managing this region for 8 years? Well, there's a reason we've had the highest turnover rate in the company during that exact same period. By late afternoon, Mrs. Lee's simple document had grown into a comprehensive record of systematic issues. But more than just a list of grievances, she saw patterns emerging, departments that had been consistently overlooked for promotions, teams whose innovative ideas had been dismissed without consideration, and talented individuals who had left the company, taking their skills elsewhere. Around 5 p.m., a young intern nervously approached her desk. "Ma'am," she whispered, "I recorded parts of the meeting on my phone. I always do it to take better notes, but today? Well, I thought you might want to have it." Mrs. Lee thanked her but gently explained that she needed to follow proper channels. Instead, she asked the intern to write down her recollection of events and email it to HR, copying Mrs. Lee. As the office began to empty for the day, the head of Human Resources, Mrs. Thompson, quietly appeared at her cubicle. "I heard about what happened," she said, pulling up a chair. "Off the record, we have a file on Mr. Porter. It's thick, but he's always had protection from above." Mrs. Lee nodded thoughtfully. "And now?" Mrs. Thompson handed her a USB drive. "This contains every formal complaint filed against him in the past 5 years. Most were withdrawn under pressure, but the records remain. I've been waiting for someone who couldn't be intimidated." Just then, Mr. Porter's voice boomed from across the office. "Still here? Trying to prove something?" He laughed coldly, walking past with his briefcase. "Enjoy it while it lasts. By this time next week, you'll be lucky to find work as a janitor." Mrs. Lee waited until his footsteps faded before turning back to Mrs. Thompson. "Thank you for this," she said, holding up the drive. "I think it's time Elite Technologies had a serious conversation about leadership." After everyone had left, Mrs. Lee stayed behind, working late into the evening. She wasn't just documenting a single incident anymore, she was building a case for fundamental change. Her screen glowed in the darkness as she compiled evidence, cross-referenced complaints, and drafted proposals for new company policies. Her phone buzzed with a message from her husband. "Everything okay? You're working late again." She replied with a smile. "I'm good. Just preparing for a very important meeting in 2 days." As she finally packed up to leave, the night cleaning crew arrived. The same staff she'd been greeting all week looked at her differently now, with a mix of concern and something else. Hope, perhaps. "You be careful, Mrs. Lee," the elderly cleaning supervisor said kindly. "Some people don't like change, even when it's needed." Mrs. Lee patted his shoulder warmly. "Change is coming whether they like it or not. But first, we need to do this right." Driving home under the stars, she reflected on how a single day could alter so many lives. Mr. Porter had no idea that his outburst hadn't revealed her weakness, it had only confirmed her purpose. In just 48 hours, Elite Technologies would never be the same, and neither would the lives of all the people who had found the courage to speak up today. The next morning arrived with a sense of purpose. Mrs. Lee entered the building before sunrise, her mind clear and focused on the task ahead. The security guard gave her a knowing nod. Word had spread quickly about yesterday's events. She began her investigation in the HR department's archives, surrounded by filing cabinets that held years of company history. The USB drive Mrs. Thompson had given her was just the beginning. There were patterns to uncover, stories to verify, and voices that needed to be heard. "You might want to look at these too," whispered Mrs. Thompson, arriving early herself. She pulled out a dusty box labeled Exit Interviews 2020 to 2023. Notice how many of them mentioned the regional office. As Mrs. Lee dug deeper, the stories began to connect like pieces of a puzzle. There was the brilliant software developer who left after being consistently passed over for promotion, despite creating the company's most successful app. The marketing specialist who transferred to another branch after her innovative campaigns were repeatedly shut down. The young intern who quit after just 2 weeks, his resignation letter containing a single telling line: "I cannot work in an environment where respect is based on appearance rather than ability." Around mid-morning, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Former Elite Tech employee here. Heard what happened. Have documentation you might want to see. Can meet for coffee." The local coffee shop became her temporary office that afternoon. One by one, former employees arrived, each carrying their own pieces of the puzzle. A retired secretary brought handwritten notes from meetings dating back 5 years. A former team leader shared emails that showed a clear pattern of discrimination in project assignments. "I'd always regretted not speaking up," said one former manager, sliding a folder across the table. "Maybe now it can make a difference." Back at the office, Mrs. Lee noticed Mr. Porter watching her through the glass walls of his office, his face twisted with suspicion. She smiled politely and continued her work, knowing that every dirty look he gave her only strengthened her case. The company's internal messaging system was buzzing with activity. Current employees, emboldened by yesterday's events, began forwarding old emails and sharing their experiences. The company's anonymous reporting system, rarely used before, suddenly lit up with detailed accounts of past incidents. "Remember the diversity initiative last year?" One message read. "Check who blocked its implementation and what reasons were given." Mrs. Lee worked through lunch, carefully organizing everything into a detailed report. She created a timeline of events, supported by documentation and witness statements. The pattern was undeniable: years of talented employees being pushed aside, innovative ideas being squashed, and company culture suffering under the weight of prejudice. In the afternoon, she received an unexpected visit from the company's longtime receptionist. "I've been here 15 years, she said quietly, "and I've watched too many good people walk out those doors. But this," she placed a thick notebook on Mrs. Lee's desk, "this is different. I've kept track of every incident I've witnessed. Names, dates, exact quotes. I always hoped someone would ask for it someday." As the day progressed, Mrs. Lee noticed something remarkable happening. The office atmosphere was changing. People who had kept their heads down for years were standing a little straighter. Conversations in break rooms became more open, more honest. It was as if a heavy cloud was finally lifting. Mr. Porter made several attempts to intimidate her throughout the day. He walked past her desk repeatedly, made loud phone calls about dealing with troublemakers, and even tried to call an impromptu department meeting, which, for the first time ever, people declined to attend. By evening, Mrs. Lee had compiled everything into a comprehensive digital presentation. The evidence was overwhelming. Dozens of documented incidents, patterns of behavior spanning years, financial losses from high turnover rates, and countless missed opportunities for innovation and growth. As she organized the final pieces of evidence, a maintenance worker stopped by her desk. "Ma'am," he said softly, "just wanted you to know, we see everything from our evening shifts. The late-night meetings, the arguments, the people crying in their cars. We've been waiting for someone like you." Mrs. Lee thanked him, adding his statement to the file. Tomorrow would be the quarterly all-hands meeting, and she had everything she needed. But this wasn't just about exposing one person's bad behavior, it was about changing an entire corporate culture. As she left the office that night, she caught her reflection in the lobby windows. The same quiet determination that had brought her through Harvard, through years of breaking barriers in corporate America, showed in her eyes. Tomorrow would be more than just a revelation. It would be a revolution in how Elite Technologies viewed leadership, respect, and human dignity. Her phone buzzed one last time. A message from Mrs. Thompson. Everything ready for tomorrow? Mrs. Lee smiled as she replied, "More than ready. It's time for change." The grand conference room on the top floor of Elite Technologies was buzzing with anticipation. Employees from all departments filed in, filling every seat and lining the walls. The quarterly all-hands meeting was always well attended, but today felt different. There was electricity in the air, an unspoken sense that something big was about to happen. Mr. Porter arrived fashionably late, as usual. He swaggered in with his designer briefcase, nodding to his usual allies. But today, their responses seemed muted, uncertain. He found his reserved seat in the front row and sprawled into it, checking his phone with apparent disinterest. "Have you seen the CEO yet?" Someone whispered nearby. Usually they're here by now. The room quieted as Mrs. Thompson from HR stepped up to the podium. "Good morning, everyone. Before we begin our quarterly review, we have an important announcement. As many of you know, our CEO has been working behind the scenes on a major company initiative." Mr. Porter shifted in his seat, probably wondering why he hadn't been briefed about this. He was, after all, a regional manager who prided himself on knowing everything happening in the company. The door at the back of the room opened and heads turned. Mrs. Lee walked in, but something was different. Gone was the simple business attire from the general office area. Today, she wore an impeccably tailored suit, her walk confident and purposeful. The room fell silent as she made her way to the podium. Mr. Porter's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then something close to horror as realization began to dawn. "Good morning," Mrs. Lee began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "For those who don't know me yet, I'm Mrs. Lee, and I'm the new CEO of Elite Technologies." The silence in the room was deafening. Mr. Porter's phone slipped from his hand, clattering on the floor. Nobody moved to help him pick it up. "Some of you know me as the new hire who spent the last week working alongside you in the general office area," she continued. "This wasn't a mistake or a mix-up in HR. It was a choice. I believe that to lead effectively, one must first understand the heart of the company, its people." She clicked to her first slide, showing a graph of employee turnover rates. "What I discovered during my week here was both concerning and inspiring. I saw incredible talent being overlooked. I witnessed innovative ideas being dismissed without consideration. But most importantly, I saw the resilience and dedication of employees who kept giving their best despite facing significant obstacles." Mr. Porter started to stand, but Mrs. Thompson subtly shook her head. He slowly sank back into his seat, his face ashen. "In just 1 week, I experienced firsthand what many of you have dealt with for years. But today marks the beginning of change." She clicked to the next slide, revealing Elite Technologies' new corporate initiative, Innovation Through Inclusion. The presentation continued for the next hour. Mrs. Lee outlined comprehensive changes to company policy, new channels for reporting workplace issues, and a complete restructuring of the promotion and project assignment processes. With each announcement, the energy in the room shifted. People sat straighter, eyes brightened, and hope began replacing fear. "Leadership isn't about power or intimidation," she emphasized, her gaze briefly meeting Mr. Porter's. "It's about creating an environment where every person can contribute their best work without fear of discrimination or retaliation." She shared success stories from other companies that had implemented similar changes, backing everything with solid data and clear implementation plans. The presentation was a masterclass in professional leadership, firm but fair, ambitious but practical. As she concluded, something remarkable happened. It started with one person in the back of the room, a quiet applause. Then another joined in and another. Soon, the entire conference room was filled with thunderous clapping and even a few cheers. Mr. Porter remained seated, staring straight ahead, his normally confident demeanor completely shattered. The same people he had belittled and dismissed for years were now witnessing his humiliation, yet there was no gloating, no revenge, just relief that change was finally coming. One final announcement, Mrs. Lee said as the applause died down. "I'll be holding individual meetings with all department heads this afternoon. Mr. Porter, I believe you're scheduled for 2 p.m. We have much to discuss." As people filed out of the conference room, the atmosphere was noticeably lighter. Colleagues who normally hurried back to their desks lingered in the hallways, talking excitedly about the future. Several people stopped to shake Mrs. Lee's hand or share a quiet word of thanks. The last person to leave was the elderly maintenance supervisor who had wished her luck 2 days ago. He paused at the door, smiled, and said simply, "Now that's what I call real leadership." Mrs. Lee gathered her materials, watching Mr. Porter through the glass walls as he walked numbly toward his office. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and hard decisions, but today had shown that Elite Technologies was ready for change. The revolution she had promised had begun, not with force or fanfare, but with quiet determination and unwavering principle. The clock struck 2 p.m. sharp when Mr. Porter knocked on the CEO's office door. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that showed in his fidgeting hands and loosened tie. The morning's revelation had left him visibly shaken, but what awaited him behind that door would change his life forever. "Come in." Mrs. Lee's voice was calm and professional. The office, once filled with the previous CEO's golf trophies and expensive art, now held only a few simple photographs of team celebrations and innovation awards. A small sign on her desk read, "Leadership is action, not position." Mr. Porter sat down heavily in the chair across from her desk. The HR director, Mrs. Thompson, was already there, a thick folder of documents in front of her. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. "Before we begin," Mrs. Lee said, opening a file on her laptop, "I want to be clear about something. This meeting isn't about revenge or punishment, it's about accountability and growth." She turned her screen to show him a presentation, different from the one she'd shown that morning. This one contained specific incidents, dates, and testimonies. Years of complaints, documented patterns of behavior, and the measurable impact on the company's performance. "Over the past week," she continued, "I've seen 2 versions of Elite Technologies. One where innovation thrives and people support each other, and another where fear and discrimination hold us back. You've been instrumental in creating the second version." Mr. Porter's face reddened. I can explain." Actually, Mrs. Lee held up a hand gently. "Please just listen for now. You'll have your chance to speak." She clicked through more slides, showing the turnover rates in his department, the number of promising projects abandoned, the talented employees who had left. "The financial cost of your management style has been significant," she pointed to a graph. "But the human cost, that's immeasurable." Mrs. Thompson opened her folder, pulling out several letters. "These are resignation letters from some of our best talent. Notice how many mention a hostile work environment or lack of professional respect." Mr. Porter slumped in his chair, the weight of his actions finally seeming to hit him. "So this is it? I'm fired." His voice was barely a whisper. Mrs. Lee leaned forward, her expression serious but not unkind. "That would be the easy solution, wouldn't it? Fire you, make a public example, and move on. But I don't believe that would solve the deeper problem." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "Instead, I'm offering you a choice. Behind door number 1 is a generous severance package and a letter of recommendation that doesn't mention any of this. You can walk away, find another job, and perhaps continue the same behaviors elsewhere." Mr. Porter blinked in surprise, clearly having expected worse. "Door number 2 is harder." She turned back to face him. 6 months probation. During that time, you'll undergo comprehensive sensitivity and leadership training. You'll work closely with our diversity and inclusion team. You'll be mentored by leaders who've successfully built inclusive departments. And most importantly, you'll need to prove that you can change." She pulled out another document. "This is a detailed improvement plan. Weekly goals, measurable outcomes, and regular feedback sessions. It won't be easy. You'll need to confront your biases, acknowledge past mistakes, and work to earn back the trust you've broken." The room fell silent as Mr. Porter stared at the papers in front of him. Outside, the office bustled with afternoon activity, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, lives continuing as his world shifted on its axis. Why? He cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. Why would you give me this chance? Mrs. Lee sat back down, her expression softening slightly. Because I believe that people can change when they're given the right motivation and support. And because firing you wouldn't address the systemic issues that allowed your behavior to continue for so long. Sometimes, the best way to fix a broken system is to transform those who helped break it. She slid both documents across the desk. The severance package and the improvement plan. The choice is yours. But know this, if you choose to stay, I'll expect nothing less than complete commitment to change. One step backward, one incident of retaliation or discrimination, and door number 1 closes forever. Mr. Porter looked down at the papers, then at Mrs. Thompson, who had witnessed years of complaints about him, and finally at Mrs. Lee, who had experienced his discrimination firsthand, yet was offering him a path to redemption. I'll need your decision by the end of the day, Mrs. Lee said, standing to indicate the meeting was over. Choose wisely. This isn't just about your career, it's about the kind of person you want to be. As Mr. Porter left the office, clutching both documents, he passed by his old department. Through the glass walls, he could see his team working, laughing, sharing ideas, looking more relaxed than he'd ever seen them. For the first time, he wondered what kind of leader they could have had if he'd spent less time intimidating them and more time lifting them up. The choice he would make that afternoon wouldn't just change his future, it would help determine whether Elite Technologies' transformation would be truly complete. Sometimes, the hardest conquests aren't won through force, but through the quiet power of offering someone the chance to become better than they ever thought they could be. 6 months had passed since that life-changing afternoon in the CEO's office. The morning sun sparkled off Elite Technologies' glass building as Mr. Porter stood in the lobby, adjusting his tie. Today was different from all the other mornings. It was the final day of his probation, and he was scheduled to give a presentation to the entire company. He walked past the security desk, exchanging warm greetings with the guard who, just half a year ago, he would have ignored completely. The elevator ride to his floor felt shorter than usual, maybe because he was no longer dreading the day ahead. "Good morning, everyone," he called out as he entered the office. Genuine smiles greeted him back, something that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. His department had transformed from a place of tension and fear into a hub of innovation and collaboration. Looking around his office, he noticed how different it was now. Gone were the intimidating dark curtains and imposing furniture. Instead, the space was bright and welcoming, with an open-door policy that he actually maintained. On his desk sat a small trophy, not for sales or performance, but for most improved leadership, voted by his own team last month. The first few weeks of his transformation hadn't been easy. The mandatory sensitivity training sessions had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his behavior. He remembered sitting in those classes, defensive at first, until a young trainer asked him a simple question: "What kind of legacy do you want to leave?" That question had stuck with him, leading to sleepless nights and deep self-reflection. The diversity and inclusion workshops had opened his eyes to perspectives he'd never considered before. He learned about microaggressions, unconscious bias, and the profound impact that leadership style had on team performance. His mentor, a successful division head from another branch, had been brutally honest with him. "You're not just learning new skills," she had said. "You're unlearning harmful habits that have held both you and your team back for years." The weekly feedback sessions with Mrs. Lee had been challenging but crucial. She hadn't just monitored his progress, she had challenged him to dig deeper, to understand the root causes of his behavior. Change isn't just about acting differently, she would remind him. It's about thinking differently. Now, as he prepared for his presentation, Mr. Porter looked through old photographs on his phone. He found one from last year's holiday party. He was standing alone, surrounded by nervous-looking employees keeping their distance. Swiping to last week's team lunch photo, the difference was striking. There he was, sitting among his team, everyone relaxed and genuinely enjoying themselves. The conference room began filling up for his presentation. He noticed faces that had once shown fear now, displaying curiosity and even respect. Mrs. Thompson from HR gave him an encouraging nod as she took her seat. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice carrying a humility that the old Mr. Porter would have seen as weakness. "6 months ago, I stood in this room as a very different person. Today, I want to share with you what I've learned about true leadership." He clicked to his first slide, a graph showing his department's performance over the past 6 months. Employee satisfaction had soared, turnover had plummeted, and innovation metrics were at an all-time high. "But these numbers don't tell the whole story," he continued. "The real change has been in how we work together. Every person in this room has taught me something valuable about leadership, respect, and the power of diversity in driving innovation." He shared specific examples: the brilliant market analysis from a team member he would have previously dismissed, the successful project led by someone he would have overlooked, the innovative solution proposed by an intern he would have ignored. "I won't pretend the journey has been easy," he admitted. "There were days when old habits tried to resurface, but each time I remembered the choice I made 6 months ago, not just to keep my job, but to become someone better." As he concluded his presentation, Mrs. Lee stood up. "Mr. Porter's transformation is not just a personal success story," she addressed the room. "It's proof that change is possible when we commit to it fully. His experience will help shape our new management training program, turning a painful chapter in our company's history into a powerful tool for positive change." The applause that followed wasn't just polite, it was genuine. Several team members even had tears in their eyes, remembering how far they'd all come together. Later that afternoon, as Mr. Porter was packing up for the day, a young employee knocked on his door. It was the same intern who had once quit after 2 weeks, now returned under the company's new inclusive hiring initiative. "Sir," the intern said, "I just wanted to thank you. Your story, it gives hope that people can change, that companies can change." Mr. Porter smiled, remembering how he would have dismissed this conversation months ago. "Thank you," he replied sincerely. "But remember, the change in this company didn't start with me. It started with every person who had the courage to speak up, to stand firm, and to believe in better." As he left the building that evening, he passed Mrs. Lee's office. She was already deep in discussion about the next phase of company improvements, but she caught his eye and gave him a slight nod, acknowledgement of a journey completed and new ones beginning. The setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Mr. Porter walked to his car. Elite Technologies had transformed over the past 6 months, and so had he. But perhaps the biggest change was in understanding that transformation isn't a destination, it's an ongoing journey of growth, learning, and becoming better than you were yesterday.